Hello the world and hello Squirrely Squad. We're going to continue today in the same vein so far, more or less quick and to the point, as best I can. This question before us here on your screen is a little bit difficult to answer in some ways. I'm going to do my best to kind of describe the question, and we'll dive into the best way that I think that you should go about answering it. So what bitrate should you stream at? Well, you kind of got to start, in order to answer this question, you got to start by asking yourself a couple other questions. But before we get to those, let's start with the most basic thing in this question in order to define it. What is even a bitrate? Well, it's the rate at which bits are transmitted or received over a network. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of a bit versus a byte, I mean, we'll actually probably get into a little bit of that here in a moment, but just know that bitrate is essentially where a piece or a bit of data is getting sent or streamed across a network, and in our case with live streaming video games or some other content, we're talking that network being the internet. So anytime you receive or download something, and likewise anytime you send or upload something, you're using that internet speed that you have, which is defined as your bitrate. So getting back to answering the question, in order to answer this question, you've got to start by asking yourself two other questions. One, what can your home internet actually allow for your bitrate? And two, what do you want your stream resolution and frames per second to be at while you're streaming? So starting with that first question, what can your home internet even allow? I want to dive into the bits aspect just really quick. Just bear with me for a second, all right? If a bit is a piece of data, right? Then I want you to know that as you go and look into your internet speeds, they're going to be defined as bits per second. So how many pieces of data are being sent every single second? And they're actually not even going to be measured in bits per second. They're going to be measured probably in kilobits per second or in megabits per second. All right. So what are kilobits and megabits? So kilobits would be KB equals 1,000 bits, essentially. All right. And megabits are 1,000 kilobits, all right? And so on and so forth with gigabits, and then terabits, and petabits, and so on and so forth. Okay, 1,000 of the previous type of bits. So in these examples, if we were to say 5 megabits per second, written just like that, as you'll see when you do the speed tests, that would equal essentially 5,000 kilobits per second, or 5 million bits per second. All right, so let's dive into how you can figure out what your bit rate is for your house. So the easiest way to kind of figure this out is quite simply Google it. Now, Google isn't going to straight tell you what your internet speed is, but it is going to give you some tools, all right? All I did here was I typed in, what is my internet speed? Let me actually increase the size here so you can read it a little bit better. What's my internet speed? And you can do a speed test right in Google, or you can go to speedtest.net, which is a really popular one, or various ISPs, internet service providers. I don't know what you have at your house, but generally speaking, most of the big names provide their own versions of speed tests. Now, do keep in mind there are going to be variations in the way these tests are performed. A lot of variables go into them, so I'm not going to go into those nitty-gritty details, but generally speaking, any one of them is going to give you a range or an average that's going to be good enough to use for figuring out what bitrate you should stream at. So if you were to run one of these particular speed tests, I'm just using that Google one. I don't typically use that Google one, by the way. Usually my download speed is a little bit better than 20 megabits per second, but that's okay. We'll go with it for now. I am on Wi-Fi right now, so it is what it is. And I'm also in a basement, so there's that. But this is what you're going to be looking at. Generally speaking, there's going to be something called the server, which is how far away you're trying to communicate with something. Not really that important for your purposes in figuring out what bitrate you should stream at. Latency is kind of important. The higher that latency, the higher the ping, as it might be denoted depending on the speed test of your choice. Whatever that ping or latency is, the higher that number, the more delay there is in those communications to the server, but also not too pertinent for depending on where you live. It's not typically too pertinent for figuring out what bitrate you should stream at. Generally speaking, what you want isn't even necessarily the first number, which is your download speed. It's really the second number, right? Because when you live stream to the internet, you are sending bits to the internet for other people to download and receive. Make sense? Are we tracking together here? So your bit rate that you care about, your max bit rate that your house can support, is your upload bit rate, your upload speed. In my case, I average between 10 and 15, give or take, megabits per second, or 10 to 15,000 kilobits per second, or million bits per second. Tracking? All right. So if you have an upload speed of 10 megabits per second at your house, should you just set your bit rate to 10 megabits per second? Absolutely not. Why? Well, we'll get into that here now. There are several other factors that you want to consider when setting your bit rate. First off, what streaming platform are you going to be on? Because depending on what streaming platform you're using, what platform you're streaming to, there might be limitations, right? For example, Facebook only allows a maximum of 1080p 60 frames per second. And even at that resolution, you have to be careful what your bitrate is set to, because they only allow a maximum of 4 megabits per second for streaming video. So if you're streaming to Facebook, that's something to consider, for example. If you're streaming to Twitch or YouTube or some of the other ones, there was a gnat. If you're streaming to Twitch or YouTube or some of those other ones, you're not going to necessarily run into that max ceiling necessarily, but there are other things to still consider nonetheless. What audience are you planning to stream to? Or more specifically, where is the audience that you're trying to stream to? Because you need to consider their internet connection, right? We're talking about looking at our upload speed because we're sending data to the internet for other people to download with their download speed or their download bit rate, right? So if you're sending a resolution in frames per second, if your bit rate is so high that it's actually higher than your audience is able to download your streams, then they're not going to be able to watch you very well, right? So if your bit rate, for example, if your streaming bit rate is set to, say, 10 megabits per second, but most of your audience is farm town area that doesn't have access to high-speed internet, and most of them have a download speed of between 3 and 5 megabits per second download, then you're streaming at a much higher resolution than they're capable of watching. Hopefully that makes sense. And this kind of brings us to a third question that you need to consider. Does the streaming platform that you're streaming to allow your viewers to downrate the bit rate that they're watching in, the resolution that they're watching in? Because if you're streaming at 1080p 60 frames per second, maybe they have the ability to only watch you at 720p 30 frames per second. And if they do, that's fantastic, because that essentially means they don't need to download all of the data that you're sending and making available. So 3 things to kind of consider. Again, what platform are you actually streaming on? Are there limitations to it? What audience are you streaming to? Does the streaming platform allow your audience to downgrade the stream resolution? So with those questions kind of answered and out of the way, to the best that you absolutely can, right? Here is a general table, or general row by row list here of what I've used in my experience for setting bit rates. This is not an end-all be-all. In fact, more often than not, this is more of a range, because there are a lot of factors that happen over the internet, over the network, right? Both locally in your house as well as off to the rest of the world. So usually, most streamers that are professional are going to point fingers at me and say, no, you need a higher bit rate there, or I kind of go, on the lower end and actually set it at a lower megabits per second. This answer isn't a definitive end-all be-all for any one of these streaming resolutions and frames per second, but as a general rule of thumb, I found that these are good starting points. All right. Now, most people on Twitch that are just getting started, I just want to throw this out there, are only streaming at 720p 30 frames per second, and the reason they're doing that is because a lot of them don't have the ability to allow their viewers to downgrade the streams if they were to stream at a higher quality. So just something to consider. Again, if you're sure that the viewers that you're watching are going to have that ability, or you're sure that your general audience isn't going to have a problem with you streaming at a higher resolution in frames per second, then by all means, go ahead and do that. And the latter end, caveat here, just throwing this out there, I haven't really gone higher than 1440p, so I've never streamed at 4K, but from what I've been able to find, generally speaking, you're going to want something between 16 and 25 or higher megabits per second upload speed in order to sustain that type of resolution in frames per second. I hope you got the answers you were looking for as regarding what bitrate you should stream at just getting started in the streaming world. See you guys on the next video. Hey Squirrely Squad. I just want to say thank you for being such an encouragement to me. And if you ever need some one-on-one encouragement, someone to pray for you, or maybe just someone to listen, you can always send me a note at the website below or email me at info@skwirls.tv. And if you liked this video, I would be eternally grateful if you'd smash that like button so others might be able to find it too. And be sure to subscribe so you can be notified when new content comes out just like it. And as always, folks, stay squirrely.